During this talk, which will not be terribly long, I'll allude to some of Thomas's comments. So maybe I can help to put all of this into some kind of perspective. I had this on the board earlier, and what amazed me is that George Kingsley Ziff wrote a nearly 600-page book on the sentence that it is the overwhelming and reason for his life work. So I thought that there would be in the audience people who may have heard of Ziff but don't know that much about him, and so I'd like to review his life to some extent and try to put all this into some kind of perspective. The book that I'm speaking of, and it's not his only book, but the book that I'm concentrating on is Human Behavior and the Principle of Least Effort, an Introduction to Human Ecology. And you can see it was published in 1949, and it's been cited again and again and again. Ziff was born in Illinois, and I'm making that point to show that he was an American scholar. He died in Massachusetts. He was at Harvard College as an undergraduate, studied in Berlin in linguistics, and then received a PhD at Harvard in comparative philology. So he was not what you might call a scientist in the traditional sense, and he was not a regional scientist or a geographer or any other kind of social scientist to begin with. His dissertation, Relative Frequency as a Determinant of Phonetic Change, that gives you some idea of what he was interested in. Relative frequency, that's the important point. He was a university lecturer, and that gave him the right and opportunity to move around the university and give lectures here and there. And in the process of doing that, he became interested in some of the social sciences. He has an earlier book on national unity and disunity, 1941, and he was well known on the campus, and I thought a personal point would be helpful, and that is that he had a number of students and they helped him immeasurably, because instead of having big data to worry about and computers to worry about, he had neither to worry about. He had to worry about his students who, in essence, created the data for him. When I say created, they were working with already published materials, but put them in an order that would help him follow what he was attempting to do. He's an icon in linguistics. In other words, we think well of him, or we refer to him quite a bit in the social sciences, but he is a bigger deal in linguistics. He discovered the dynamic character of language. He developed a systemic view in linguistics, and he has had many projects on words, their frequency in speech and writing, and that all came before getting into the social sciences. Then he transferred his ideas to settlement geography, economic psychology, and sociology, but he was still working at all times on his definition of the principle of least effort. Okay, the individual. Words, evolution, speech, language, the ego, the mind, the dreams, all of these subjects were used to introduce us to his proof of this principle that he is going to develop, or at least in the book that he is going to develop. In human relations, and in the social science aspect of it, is in settlement patterns, cooperation and conflict, economic power and social status, prestige and cultural vogues. So he, in a sense, he has to be a Renaissance man to be able to pull all of these different fields together after his main goal. But there were a number of others who actually came up, not with the principle of least effort, but with distributions that really were like his, and in fact sometimes were his. But he did not copy from those people, but he did recognize them. And you may recognize these names. Of course, they do come up in economics and geography. Pareto, Auerbach, Ewell, Lotka, Gebrat, and Reshevsky, among others. There were others as well. Here represents his assertions. And I call these assertions. He would not himself call these assertions. This is his theory. Least effort in terms of minimizing time or distance or other impediment to completing a job. This is what people do. Probably, and notice the words, probably it's the least average rate of work. That is his definition of least effort. And he had to work to try to get that definition, because if he just assumed that everyone all the time engaged in a least effort activity all the time, it wouldn't work. So he had to stretch it over first till the present time, and then he had to stretch it over a lifetime. And then instead of putting it into probabilistic terms, he said probably least average rate of work. So even at the beginning, as he is attempting to prove this theory, he has his reservations. Tools need jobs. That's one of his principles. Jobs need tools. Forces of unification and diversification. That's another one of his principles. That's going to play a big role in his work in the social sciences. Forces of unification and diversification. And Luke this morning talked a bit about not Ziff's principle, but his own principle of these forces. There's many, many more of these assertions. And as you read this book, which is not an easy book to read, but as you read this book, he adds a new assertion whenever he needs one in order to get through to the next issue. That is, if you have any doubts about least effort, he abolishes those doubts as he develops a new concept. But these concepts come very, very smoothly, and there is a proof. And when I say proof, not in the hard, rigorous science sense, but in a whole process of empiricism, which I'll speak about. His empirical discovery with language, and while he was in the philology area, certain words, phrases occur in speech and writing at all ages and in all serious circumstances many times, while certain words occur seldomly. Attempts to show this phenomenon leads his least effort principles. He had his students, for example, take the book Ulysses, James Joyce, and looked at every word and transcribed how often that word was repeated, and came up with this theory that fit very well into language, where children, as they learn, are using certain words very often and other words very seldomly, as they use this least effort principle to learn how to speak and eventually write. So this became Ziff's rank frequency empirical regularity, which he showed in the language sciences. But then he transferred to from frequency to numbers of occurrences, which is the same, and size. And that became what people knew as Ziff's rank size rule. And in fact, that is what Thomas was speaking about, the rank size rule. In his first foray from linguistics, he applied it to the size distribution of cities, and he came up with this really simple idea that you take the first largest city in a country, and the second largest city will have half the population of the first, and the third will have 1/3 of the first, the fourth will be 1/4 and 1/5, and the 20th will be, the population of the 20th largest city will be 1/20th of the size of the largest city. And this is where the rank size rule came from. Except that if you logged rank and if you logged size, you would get a straight line on double log paper. So we have a power law, and if all worked out well and the superscript worked well, we would have a straight line with slope -1. And this is the rank size rule in operation here for ranks of US cities in, actually this is 1940, and there's New York, and now you might say, well, what did he use as a city? Let's not get into that. And he didn't get into that either. He just took things right out of the census, whatever he could get. And there are the first, the second, the third, and so forth, and they follow his very nice -1 distribution. This is what Thomas was speaking of. He also did this for the United States cities from 1790 up to 1930, and shows that it was shaky at first, but it eventually straightened out, as it should, according to the least effort principles. But what's interesting, and what we should all be aware of when we think of the rank size rule, is that cities change position all the time, but the rank size rule still holds, is the point. That is, take a look at Houston in, 1910, was way down here at the bottom, and by 1930, it was way, way up there near the top. And if we went on to 2010, what you'd find, it would be shaky again, because New York hasn't kept up its obligations as a #1 city. And in fact, you might say it a different way. Los Angeles and Chicago, including its metropolitan area, and other cities, including Boston and San Francisco and so on, have all challenged New York and aren't 1/2 or 1/3, or they're more than that of the largest city. He went about all of this with a great deal of empirical work, much of which is very interesting and very helpful. The number and diversity of service establishments follows the rule, number and diversity of manufacturers, specific occupations, gross receipts, he had many ideas, number of obituaries in the New York Times, by where those obituaries took place, as it were. And I write, and on, and you can find 20 or 30 or 40 different rank size rule affirmations. The literature in this field is very large. Not all are incisive. I wrote most trenchant: Beckman, Batty, Berry, Pumain, Chen and Zhao. Ionides has done quite a bit of work in this area. Gabay turns out to be important, and Parr, who is not here but is someone that we all admire. But I wanted to show also that work is going on in this area all the time. And I wrote 2 weeks ago, Leah Nam in a regional science journal analyzed Chinese cities and found, as many people find, it doesn't work. And as many of you probably know the reason why, but at least it just doesn't work. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But I say 2 weeks ago, I'll just say a few minutes ago, someone else was working in this area. Over 100 articles in which the rank size rule is discussed or tested. In other words, lots of people are fascinated by it. And it should not be, even though many instances show that it doesn't work, shouldn't detract us from admiring the work that he did or the possibilities that under other conditions it might work, so that it hasn't left our literature. The consensus: remarkable empirical regularity about half the time. The primate city argument, Berry and Garrison, and a number of others show that if you have, let's say France, you have a huge primate city, you don't get the rank size rule. In other words, the second city, third, and so on, are much smaller than what you would expect, Marseille, and so on. But it's also true in developing countries as well. Accra in Ghana is way larger than anything else coming along. And some people would argue that that's the characteristic of a developing country, where everything is kind of oriented toward the main city that has the government and the big industries and so on like that. But you can always find variations on that. What troubles regional scientists and geographers is the need for an explanation. We're not happy with just seeing a nice empirical regularity. We want to know why, and that's the difficult challenge. Izard spent many pages displaying Ziff's empiricism, but thought the theory confusing. And the theory is, if you can't call it confusing, you'd have to call it a bit tricky, I think, which maybe he probably wouldn't like that. But people tend to like Gebrat's law. Gebrat came up with the law of proportional growth. The growth rates are independent of city size, but absolute growth is roughly proportional to city size. And that tends to work better. It works better at the ends of the distribution. Big problem with the distribution is taking that first city as the guide for further work. Continuing interest in Ziff, as we have learned today. The principles and form and function of cities follows very nicely, and people are constantly doing further empirical work in that area. The theory to be formalized where definitions and rigor prevail, and that's one of the interests, that is, try to put this on more rigorous footing. If you look at the book, you'll see that there is quite a bit of rigor, but not in the sense of model building. Much more in terms of the actual probabilities that might be used in order to estimate these forces, these parts of his theory, like the theory of diversification or unification. Flows and networks, people feel that there was some work in that. Ziff recognized the importance of distance and did correlate a lot of his variables against PP over D work, and most of that came out very nicely for him. Do new urban structures conform to the principles? And I think we shouldn't forget about that as we start to study the smart city and the influence of technology on the growth and development of cities. I think if we keep in mind this principle, perhaps restated, we may find a little bit more light than we are finding right now. Could be. New urban thinking. Is there a place for Ziff? I say that there probably is. Will cities of the future, which we are creating now, find a least effort principle that holds city systems together? Which is another one of the points that I found lacking in the book, but people weren't talking so much about, they were talking about systems of a particular variable, but they were not talking about integrating systems. And he did not talk about scale. And as you all know, that's a very crucial point to be raised in our analyses. We must be able to integrate and show networks, but we have to be cognizant of the scales that they're operating on. There is our friend, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for a very clear and illuminating speech. If I would start on the linguistic side of Ziff, then the question has always been also in the discussion on the validity of Ziff's law, also in linguistics. What to do, what are you measuring? What to do with synonyms, for instance, or semi-synonyms? Because the students who had to do all the calculations had to know not only the single word, but also what is the meaning of words which might more or less express the same, or a word which is identical but has a different meaning. That's number one. And that has to do also with city issues later on. The second issue is that in many cases, words are related to other words, i.e. if you use a word, you often use in combination with other words, and you can continue, etc., etc. Yes. What is then the probability of using a whole sentence and so on?
He did work with phrases. He did do that. Yeah.
Yeah, but that is, of course, and that is the parallel, in my view, to geography. But on the one hand, is a city which you measure and another order, lower order city, identical in terms of its structure, composition, and function to the other one? If there is a case of smart specialization, it might be totally different. So that, of course, questions the validity of the Zipf's law.
Yeah.
And second, again using the linguistic metaphor,
yeah.
If you use words in combination, in fact, it's spatial autocorrelation in geography, because certain things come back in combination at a lower order.
Yes.
And it might be interesting to hear from you how far Zip went in this respect.
Yeah. Well, let me respond by telling you one of my conclusions of the next paper I'm going to give, but not here, lucky you, about Walter Izard's reading of Zipf. And why I looked into that was simply that Izard was one of the careful readers. There aren't too many careful readers. It's not smooth stuff. He was very concerned about it, and in fact devotes in his Location Space Economy, 1956, he devotes a whole chapter, not so much to Zipf, but to empirical regularities, most of which have to do with Zipf and Zipf's work. And I bring this up to show that Izard was confused. He went along and was willing to put in all of that empiricism because Izard didn't have any place else to go. There weren't, as many of you contribute to the world of empiricism and get ideas from it, there was relatively little of that in those days. And he Izard criticized the economists for being spaceless and the geographers for being simple-minded. He had all those ideas. No, it's not the case today. But the point is, and what I'm trying to say is that it was taken seriously. He didn't go back over the philology and that area, but he did take the economic aspects of it. And Izard was a great proponent of localization economies, urbanization economies, and what is the other, a third economy that he professed. And those became actually the mainsprings of regional science. And he was reacting to Zipf in a footnote that goes on for several pages, that he was so disturbed by Zipf's ability to come up with these beautiful rank size rule distributions without having Izard's point of view. Zipf depended on unification and diversification, which were not clearly defined. Only once he did say that it could be the exponent in one of the equations of the rank size rule. But Izard didn't agree with that because he thought agglomeration and the reason why cities are formed and so on didn't come from that, came from these economies that I've just mentioned. So.
This was great, Arthur. Thank you. I wanted to, there's so many things that I want to say, but I'll just point out a couple of them. So I actually just looked, I published a paper last year which also examined Zipf for the US, India, China, and Brazil. And your citation is exactly right. China is an outlier and is uniquely poorly fit by Zipf law. It turns out that China is also uniquely poorly fit by Gibraltar's law. That actually of all three other countries have roughly, proportional growth, whereas China has very strong mean reversion, which seems to conform to the Gibraltar's law of not playing some role behind Zipf. But it's to me at least, that's only a partial answer, right? Because then we have to understand why Gebrat's law operates when it operates, which rather than, sort of as statistical, mathematical equivalence between the two, but rather, we crave something greater. And I guess, I don't know if you had this reaction, but and it's been years since I've read Zip at all seriously, and I don't claim to have read it nearly as well as you have. But I had this feeling of just absolute awe with his genius with the data. And then when we get to the principle of least effort, you just feel like this is the best you can come up with in terms of explaining this, something that doesn't feel like it rings. It rings true in a few contexts, but it hardly rings true universally.
Well, people immediately think least work, least energy, least effort. When he tried to kind of soften the blow of those. But that's true. I mean, all of that, the Chinese situation. Well, of course, people explain the variations by government decree or, planning that's outside of the box or, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I thought it was great, Art. There's a fellow in Heidelberg called Alexander Zip. He's in GIS, basically, and I asked him whether he was related in any way to George. Because Zip is not a very common name, I think, in Germany. He didn't know, in fact. He'd heard of Zip, but he didn't know.
He's found out.
But one of the intriguing things, I think, and this is not a derogatory comment at all about Zip, is that when Zip first did his analysis, if you wanted to plot a scatter diagram of a number of points, then once you got to 100, then it became hard work. And 200 was even harder work, and 300 and so on. So in other words, he was dealing with a small data set. And the top 100 cities in the United States do almost perfectly follow Zip's law.
They did.
Krugman, in his self-organizing economy book, basically plots this and says it's the only iron law in the social sciences, basically. But if you now plot the top 20,000, it's much more like a log normal distribution. There's absolutely no question about it. And many people in this area have said, well, really, it's the heavy tail or the long tail that we're fitting the power law to in that particular context. And it's this notion of how you define the system. Yet again, it's how you define the city. So, for example, if you take the cities in the United States, and you get the top 100 get the Zipf's law of -1 in terms of that rank size distribution. If you then add Canada to it, right, and certainly from my perspective, probably adding the Canadian cities to it makes a bit of sense, then it's 0.9 or 1.1. So to some extent, the general point is, how do you define the system? Notwithstanding the fact that the cities themselves are problematic, because obviously I don't know whether Zip, how he dealt with New York, but in something like 1900 or was it 1910, the 5 boroughs became one within New York like in terms of the census data. So all of these kind of questions really float around the analysis, notwithstanding the fact that the Zip law is repeated in many times, at least for the heavy tail or the long tail.
Well, he, with talking about the definition of cities, which we have been talking about here, that a word is a word. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why he is so admired in glottometrics, it's called. He was the first actually quantitative linguist. And he's really honored by those people in that field today. But a city is not a word, and a city is not always a city, and that's true. And looking at different census definitions and so on, we get all sorts of things. And in fact, if we're interested in just the boundaries, the political boundaries of, or let's say the metropolitan boundaries of a city, Jacksonville, Florida is one of the largest cities in the United States. I mean, it just has boundaries that take up nearly a whole chunk of North Florida. So watch out for Jacksonville. or their football team.
Art, could I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned scale at the end of your talk. Has Zipf's law been applied to intra-urban at the intra-urban scale. A lot of central place theory is very, very powerful. I'm thinking of Brian Barry's, cities as systems within systems or whatever.
Yes.
But are there zip type regularities? I mean, the boundaries are hard to define, but
Yeah. Well, it strikes you right away that.
the intra and the inter are increasingly becoming mingled as we get urban regions and so on.
I have in one of my past works, I have a map of Lansing, East Lansing, Michigan, and all of the different types of boundaries, the sewage treatment plant boundaries, and the water district boundaries, and this boundary, the school district boundaries, and so on. And they do not correspond. So you're working at a lot of different scales at the same time.
Which was an edited volume that I did 10 years ago, which does zips law for 4x4 mile squares for the U.S. So instead of using any political boundaries, they just define 4x4 mile squares, and it doesn't work at all. It actually doesn't. So if you just define it with a basic random graph, you need the political boundaries for it to actually work.
And by the way, he did also, as did Birch and Kristaller, assume to begin with, a homogeneous plane, people distributed homogeneously in a kind of he didn't say hexagonal surface, but that's what we knew what he meant.
Well, thank you, Arthur. I think that's the first time I've heard East Lansing referred to in an academic presentation, so I appreciate that. The first time I've heard East Lansing referred to in a proper presentation, so.
The center of the universe.
It was the sewer system, that's true. So thank you very much.